Football at 4, powered by Inside the Birds podcast. Check out their latest podcast, dropped just this morning. Very, very insightful conversations with Todd Herremans and Trey Thomas. Geoff Mosher, Adam Kaplan, co-hosts of the Inside the Birds podcast. And Geoff Mosher joins us every Monday and Wednesday here on 97.3 ESPN, as all guests do on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Geoff, how you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing great. How are you guys doing on this very frigid, unseasonably cold July day?
I love where you went with that. I'm just glad I'm sitting in air conditioning today, and I'll just leave it at that. How about that?
God bless you.
Geoff, we would be remiss if we didn't start with this whole situation that's going on with baseball, because in some ways it does relate to the NFL, because like baseball, the NFL, their plan is not a legitimate bubble. There's an isolation element to it, but there is not a true bubble like the NBA and the NHL is doing. So is there something that the NFL can learn or take from the baseball situation right now?
Yes. I mean, I think what the NFL can look at, and we've all been having this discussion for a while. I know when I've been on with you guys and Mike and Hunter, the one thing I've consistently said is, football does not start until September. And in a way that's kind of good while these other sports attempt their comebacks, because eventually one of these sports will show us the way. The way may not be the way we want, but we will be shown the way. And so with baseball in particular, because that's closer to what you're going to see with football, with no bubble, teams playing in their home cities, when you see that the Marlins had players test positive and then kind of this meeting or text chain going on to decide whether or not they wanted to play, and they all decided they wanted to play, and then the situation got worse, I think what the NFL should look at is kind of an idea of saying we can't let the players police themselves. All right, we cannot let the players decide through text message or whatever that if just a couple of players have coronavirus or something, that this is okay. Well, business as usual. We've all decided as a group. You have infectious disease experts who I believe will be, guiding the light there for all the teams, and their word has to be concrete, in my opinion. I mean, I just feel like the orders have to be followed there. So if that's going to be the case, I think that you just can't I think that's what we can learn right now from what we're seeing in baseball, is that you got to take the decision-making out of the hands of and even the coaches, because they think like players too. They just want to go out there, compete, and they think they're invisible as well. It's got to be a higher authority there.
Absolutely. I agree completely. But, you mentioned this, and I think it's obvious to all sports fans at this point that the bubble concept compared to the no bubble concept is obviously way different. And do you think it might be a long shot that the NFL sees that the NHL and NBA is working? The plan is definitely going to, at least right now, it's going as planned. So is it possible to make a shift to a bubble concept if the alternative is what's happening with the Miami Marlins?
Yeah, I've thought about that, Hunter. We'll see. I think the NFL should look into that as a plan B, as a contingency, as something they may have to think about as they get a little bit closer. I imagine there are obstacles. The NHL plays in two cities. They got a bunch of teams playing in two rinks, basically, right? And the NBA is playing in a bubble in Orlando, and I think they're using the same court for pretty much every game. Am I correct on that? It's just one court being used for all the games?
They have three courts.
They have three different courts along with the practice facility.
Right. So I guess you can find some cities that have a couple of colleges.
Right, because if they're not going to have fans, does it need to be an NFL stadium? It could just be a football field. Right.
And maybe they can find some of those, like the fields that the XFL were using, or the AFL, whatever it was, AFFL the year before that folded very quickly. Maybe you can find something that has a comfortable atmosphere. I mean, I do think college stadiums might be an interesting one. That all just depends on whether there's college football or not. But I don't think it's as easy as what the NBA and the NHL are doing. It's just hard to find places that have all of the amenities that you're going to need for all of these football teams and players. And when you do find a place that may have enough fields, does it have enough hotels the way Disney does. I mean, it's something the NFL should look into. I don't know how realistic it will be. I mean, at the end of the day, maybe you can get it done and it's less than desirable resources, but I think the NFL is going to exhaust every opportunity of getting it done the way they want to do it first, and then maybe having that as a plan B.
Geoff, you mentioned about the players policing themselves, and I know when some of the NFL's restrictions initially were coming out over the weekend that people were saying, oh, this is ridiculous. You mean you're really going to suspend a guy for doing X, Y, Z? But now in light of the baseball situation and a month ago with the MLS situation where they literally just kicked 2 teams out of their tournament, they basically just told DC and Nashville, stay home and don't go anywhere. It feels like that whether it's the NBA's restrictions or the NFL's proposed restrictions, it feels like that these restrictions are a little less extreme and a lot more logical.
Yeah, it's hard to determine what's logical or not right now. I mean, I think you're right in saying, I mean, if you look at just the fact that the COVID tests are 0% with NBA and NHL,
correct?
Right? I mean, that's the latest test, but they have 0%. You can't ignore that. You can't look and say, well, geez, they're getting it done. And MLS too, you can't ignore the success that they're having for now. I mean, everything can change and not try to at least incorporate some of what they're doing into what you're doing if you can.
Here's what scares me the most about football. The fact that there's an outbreak in a Miami Marlins clubhouse in a sport where you social distance majority of the game, and now we're talking about football where you're tackling one another, you're in the trenches. I just don't know how the nature of the sport allows this to happen.
I agree with you. I don't. There's a lot of questions. I mean, I think first and foremost, doesn't everybody want to know how this happened? And I don't know if it's been out there, at least with the Marlins. You know, how is it that with all the testing they've been doing, they still had to have an outbreak? So does that mean somebody wasn't following protocol? Is it just got picked up while they were in transit? Who knows? But those are kind of the questions that the NFL should be asking. Like, how did this happen? And then when they find the answer, you got to write into whatever the agreement is now. Let's add an addendum that there's none of this, there's none of that. If there's a couple of guys tested, then everybody kind of steps back. No team decision. And so, yeah, again, I'm very perplexed on how it happened, and I'm a little bit discouraged because I thought things were going to work. But
well, Geoff, it reminds me of.
See. By the way, I don't want to be an alarmist. It's not like baseball is completely shut down altogether. It's just, you know.
Well, there's a Diamondbacks Padres game going on right now on the television.
Yeah, so there's not a whole reason to be completely alarmed and discouraged. This thing is going to be a failure.
But I thought the question you just asked is important, which is how did this happen? And I think back to how the NFL players pushed and pushed. We want daily testing. Baseball doesn't have daily testing. They do this every 24 to 48 hours. It gets sent to a lab, and they got to wait for the result. Like, the reason why Juan Soto still hasn't played is because even though he was asymptomatic and one test was positive, one test was negative, he has to wait 24 hours, and then another 24 hours, and then another 24 hours. The NBA, the NHL, the MLS, the UFC, these are all Premier League. They're testing in these dudes every single day, and I feel it's so important the NFL players pushed, thanks to their player reps, pushing to say, no, we want testing every day.
Yes, it's a great point. They push for it. Now you see why they push for it. And here's the thing. As much as they push for it, I believe the ultimate agreement was they are going to test every day up till maybe the first 2 or 3 weeks, and then they have a plan to scale back the testing after that, if I'm not mistaken.
Right.
So now you're looking at it and you say, well, maybe that wasn't the smartest idea. I mean, the MLB made it, 3 weeks of camp into the start of the season, and now they're having these issues. Maybe they need to go back and push and say, hey, you know what? We should have everyday testing for at least the entirety of training camp and maybe the first 2 weeks of the season. So if not, longer than that.
Doug Peterson spoke today to the media. Anything stand out to you?
Doug is going to be Doug. Doug is always going to put a shiny, optimistic, positive message forth. And sometimes you have to wonder if he really believes everything he's saying. I mean, he made it, I listened, he said he was as safe can be. And then the NovaCare is their bubble, and he's not fearful one bit. And I think as a head coach, after all the organization has done to do, to safeguard, he has to put that message across. But if I shot him up with truth serum and said, you don't think that there's any chance that there could be an outbreak, or you're not fearful whatsoever of something happening that would stop your team from practicing and playing, I think his answer might be a little bit different.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that, because Doug said, and the quote you tweeted out was Doug saying, you've got to have a plan for everything. Well, I would assume that part of having that plan for everything has to do with the fact that the Eagles keep shaving off more and more guys off of this roster. Almost they're planning for a scenario where they're not going to have a lot of contingency plans, and they may have to cut down the roster sooner than they planned for. And some of the names are guys that you and Adam mentioned on the Inside the Birds podcast.
Yeah, there weren't a whole lot of surprises, I thought, in the cuts. Even Deshaun Hall, who was a player who was the darling of training camp last year and didn't really play much in the regular season, but then got hurt. Even after all that, he tore his ACL, so you thought he might get a chance to come back. It didn't surprise me that he was among the cuts, because he's what do they got, like 7 or 8 defensive ends already competing, so that didn't surprise me. Obviously, Shelton Gibson didn't surprise me. The defensive tackle, they cut Albert Huggins. We thought if they were going to trim off a defensive tackle, he would be the one. So there really wasn't any surprises. And you're right, they still have, I think, 3 more to go. So it'll be interesting to see which names they come out with. We mentioned some of those on the podcast that we thought would be vulnerable that are still on the roster now, and probably wondering the same thing that we're all talking about.
Well, speaking of the most recent ITB podcast that dropped this morning, you also had Todd Herremans on, and he spoke about Jason Peters moving from left tackle to right guard. What did you think about what he had to say?
Well, Todd is interesting, and like Todd is as he admits on the program that we did, he's very fond of Jason Peters. He's admires his career, thinks the world of him, and as he even mentioned, that kind of makes him tend to think it's going to work out well. Although he said that. He said, I'm not trying to minimize how difficult it is, but Jason Peters is a different breed of human being. And so it wouldn't surprise me if it was a smooth transition. But he also acknowledged that there's going to be a lot of different technique and hand placement and things that Jason will have to adjust to. And if you kind of listen to Trey Thomas talk about it, who we've had on, who you guys have had on, Trey is a little bit more, I would say, I don't want to say pessimistic, but he's a little bit more concerned about some of those changes that'll have to be made, and that acclimation into going from tackle to guard for Jason Peters, specifically because of Jason's age and how long he played the left tackle position for. So it's just interesting. It's 2 guys who played together, Trey and Todd, but they kind of see it a little bit differently, where one feels like Jason's got Peters has a really good chance to make it, and the other one's a little bit more skeptical.
Geoff Mosher joining us here on the Boardwalk on the Hotline on 97.3 ESPN Football at 4, powered by the Inside the Birds podcast. Of course, you can follow Geoff as well on Twitter at Geoff Mosher NFL. Geoff, I also was interested what Todd was saying in the contrast you mentioned with Trey is there something to be said for the fact that Todd did have to make that transition multiple times? Because he talked about the fact that they were training him at multiple positions, whereas Peters, and you guys even asked about this, Peters has basically played one position almost the entirety of his career, whereas Todd was consistently being switched around.
Yes. Yeah, Todd had that benefit, and not only that, but the benefit of playing multiple positions and being able to maneuver. But as Todd mentioned, a couple of things. One, he always had like the type of arms, shorter arms for a tackle that enabled him to play guard. But he also had a long, slender body that enabled him to play tackle, even with the shorter arms that are more natural for guard. So his body type was able to maneuver for both. Jason's not like that tall, slender guy. Jason Peters is a little bit built more like a tackle, I think, than a guard. But, we'll see how that goes. But also Todd whenever Todd was going to make the switch, it was already made clear to him either at the end of the prior season or at the start of spring the next year that was probably where they were going to put him. They always were able to cross-train him a lot so that it wasn't like a complete surprise. Now, Jason Peters is going to attempt to do this with 0 camps spring camps, 0 OTAs, 0 mini camps, and then not even a real ramp-up process until a good 2.5 weeks from the start of training camp. So he's got a very, very small amount of time to get prepared for a completely different position. And mind you, he was a tight end in college, so it's not like he can even go back and say, hey, I remember playing guard a little bit in college and here. I mean, this is just absolutely new to him.
On InsideTheBirds.com, you predicted that the Eagles and the Cowboys would finish with the same exact record of 10-6, but the Cowboys winning due to a tiebreaker. And I'm curious, what were your thoughts when predicting that based off the fact that they have a new coach and they have to implement a whole new system in this environment compared to Doug Peterson, who has been here for a couple seasons now?
Well, it's actually not the case, Hunter. That's a big reason why I'm giving the Cowboys the benefit of the doubt. In fact, I've heard this from several coaches and personnel people in the league that the best thing that the Cowboys were able to do was keep Kellen Moore as their offensive coordinator, because they're going to run that same offense that Kellen Moore has been presiding over. So it's not going to be a whole lot of new language. It's not going to be a whole lot of new philosophies, new theories or anything. And that really will help them compared to, say, the Giants learning a new system and the the Washington football team learning a new system and things like, and a lot of these teams that have new coaches and quarterbacks. So it really, that one holdover, I think, is going to make a really big difference for Dallas and help them out. Now, does that mean they're going to win the division and finish in the tie? You know what it's like when you're just making projections. But the one thing that has been consistent, at least since 2003 and 2004, is that whoever's won the NFC East has not won it again the next year. Right, so that's 15 years almost now of a new of a different team winning the division than the year before.
Speaking of making projections, Geoff, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't bring up the big trade that happened with Jamal Adams, a topic that you and Adam have talked about frequently here on Football at 4 as well as the Inside the Birds podcast. And part of what's interesting is it involves the guy who used to be here with the Eagles, Joe Douglas, getting a lot of picks in return from a marquee player. So, what was your reaction to the trade, and how do you think this trade may play out for both of those franchises?
I mean, on theory, it's like, wow, the Jets won the trade because they got 2 first-round picks. They got a pretty good, decent enough player to play safety, and then I believe also a third-round pick, and they give up a player and a fourth. So anytime you get 2 first-round, that's quarterback trade compensation, to be honest. So to get that for safety is a great thing. It's just it's almost like it works for both, though, because Seattle was a Super Bowl contender before they make the trade, and now they are definitely a Super Bowl contender, if not more equipped to be able to win the Super Bowl. And they are a very forward-thinking organization, so it wouldn't surprise me if the Seahawks were thinking, you know what, there might not even be college football this year. Like, how hard it's going to be really hard to scout players who are going to be available for next year's draft if they don't even have a season's worth of college football. So let's let the Jets worry about that more, and we'll just take the immediate talent now. I could see that being part of their philosophy. So even though I think the Jets kind of, if you just take the context out, it seems like the Jets win the trade. You can certainly say the Seahawks did well because they have a player that they're adding to a really good team, and they have an opportunity now to win a Super Bowl because of it. And I think the Jets, while you can say, hey, that's great, they got 2 first-round picks, this is an organization that's constantly picking in the top 10 in the first round and constantly adding picks, and yet they have yet to really kind of establish themselves as a very good organization in this league for a long time. So, if you're looking at it objectively, you hope it's a win-win for both.
Yeah, there's no doubt that Seattle got a great player that you can put in so many different spots, safety, linebacker. I mean, he does it all. But I just wonder, with a contract like Russell Wilson, hitting on high draft picks is very important because of how much money they cost when you have a quarterback that's getting paid so much money. So from that point, a couple years down the road, will it hurt them missing out on these first-round picks when it comes to financial stuff? Because you also have to pay a guy like Adams a lot of money.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And so, look, the Seahawks have a lot of injuries. If they have an Eagles-like year of last year or the year before, and they don't make the playoffs and they're not competitive, it's really going to come back to bite them in the rear end. If, by chance, Jamal Adams is helps them get deep into the playoffs and win a Super Bowl, though, they're going to say it's all worth it.
Jeff, you mentioned about being all worth it. I got to think, though, how many times have we seen, and I asked Hunter this earlier, how many times have we seen trades and teams get a slew of picks and they don't do anything with those picks? And I'm not trying to disparage Joe Douglas, but he hasn't really been on the job that long. We don't know what kind of executive he's going to be. And, I think about, when the Redskins traded up for RG3 or when the Eagles traded up for Carson Wentz. What did those teams trading down do with those picks? Or when the Saints traded away that haul for Ricky Williams. So just getting picks is always a dicey situation too, is it not?
No, I agree with you. And again, you take the history of the organization into account. The Jets have shaky ownership, shaky management. They're constantly on different coaches, which means you're on different schemes sometimes, year to year to year. So even if you hit on a good draft pick, maybe he doesn't fit your scheme because you were drafting for a 4-3 and now you're running a 3-4 or vice versa. So it certainly is the case. I mean, look at the Bears trade to get Khalil Mack and they gave up all the picks to the Raiders. Now, maybe the Raiders will be good. It looks like Josh Jacobs is a good player. It looks like Max Crosby is a guy they got late, is a good player. We'll see about Cleveland Farrell, and we'll see about some of the guys they got in this year's draft. But you saw the impact that one player had on the Chicago Bears. They went from the worst team to the best team in the division that year. And even though they struggled last year, they still were competitive. I think they finished at 500, despite having really terrible quarterback play. So you would say you'll take the Khalil Mack over the picks every single time.
And if I could circle it back to the Eagles, what does it say to you that this is now another player? We've seen this before. I remember with Jalen Ramsey and other guys where the Eagles, they were not willing to give up $1 billion picks to get a player, and these other teams are willing to do it. What does that say about Roseman and the Eagles' plans?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, I can't imagine Howie ever giving up that much compensation for a player at that position. Even though they've treated safety, I'd say, with a little bit more respect over the last few years. I can't imagine giving up 2 first-round picks for a safety. Maybe a pass rusher, yes. Maybe a left tackle, yes, but not a safety. So I think that's a smart thing. Obviously we've talked about the cap situation that the Eagles are in. They'll figure it out. Obviously they have to, but adding on a player of that caliber at that position to give up that much and then have to pay that much. And you have to look at yourself, is he making us a Super Bowl champion? I don't know. I mean, Jamal Adams, I don't know if he definitely makes the Seahawks like a top 3 team, but he fits what they do defensively so well, it's worth it. And, they're a couple of years now into that Wilson extension. So I think it just says about Howie Roseman that it's not that he's unwilling to do a deal. It's just going to be for the right kind of player for what they value.
He's Geoff Mosher. Check out the Inside the Birds podcast dropped this morning. Todd Herremans, Trey Thomas, great insights from those guys. Also follow Geoff on Twitter at Geoff Mosher NFL. As all guests, he appeared today on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. Geoff, always appreciate the time.
Thanks, fellas. Talk to you soon.